The Liberators, when darkness met light in the mountains of Austria. The weight of orders and the whisper of conscience. The Sherman tank rolled through the Austrian countryside with a rumble that seemed to shake the very earth beneath it. Private Marcus Johnson sat in the gunner's seat, his hands resting on the controls of the 75mm cannon, his eyes scanning the forested mountains ahead. It was May 1945, and the war in Europe was essentially over. Germany had surrendered just days before, and the 761st Tank Battalion, the first all-black tank unit to see combat in the European theater, was conducting what was supposedly mopping up operations. Marcus had joined the army believing in something. He had believed that fighting for his country might somehow transform his country, that if he bled for America, America might finally acknowledge his humanity. He was 24 years old, from Memphis, Tennessee, where his father had been a sharecropper and his mother had worked as a maid in white people's homes. They had scraped together enough to send him to a segregated school, had taught him to read and to think, had given him the dangerous gift of intelligence in a world designed to keep him ignorant. The 761st had been activated in March 1944 and had seen its first combat 6 months later, during the Battle of the Bulge. They had fought with distinction, had lost men, good men, strong men, men who had believed in the same ideals that Marcus believed in. But they had also proven something, that black soldiers could fight as well as white soldiers, that color had nothing to do with courage or competence or the willingness to die for something you believed in. And yet, even now, weeks after the war's end, even as they drove deeper into Austria in pursuit of retreating German forces, Marcus knew that their success on the battlefield wouldn't translate to respect at home. The 761st would return to America and be segregated again, would be treated again as less than, would be expected to accept their subordinate status as if the past year hadn't happened. That knowledge sat in his chest like a stone. "Contact ahead," Sergeant William McBurney's voice crackled over the radio. McBurney was the tank commander, a man from Massachusetts who had shown consistent respect for his crew, a respect that was rare enough in the army to be noteworthy. Possible German position. Proceed with caution. Marcus's jaw tightened. They had been pursuing what military intelligence suggested were retreating Wehrmacht units. The intelligence was sometimes accurate and sometimes wildly wrong. Either way, the 761st had developed a reputation for being the unit that got sent into the worst situations, partly because their officers trusted them, partly because the army seemed to believe that black soldiers' lives were somehow more expendable than white soldiers' lives. The tank crested a rise, and what they saw made everyone inside go silent. Ahead of them, nestled in a mountain valley, was a massive complex of buildings surrounded by barbed wire fences. Guard towers rose at intervals. And even from a distance, even from inside the tank where visibility was limited, Marcus could sense something wrong about the place. It had the quality of a structure built for a purpose that went beyond normal military installations. "That's not a military installation," Private David Chen said from the driver's seat. Chen was from California, a third-generation Chinese-American who had experienced his own forms of discrimination but who had bonded with the black tankers in the 761st in a way that suggested they recognized in each other a shared understanding of exclusion. "That looks like." "I don't know what that looks like." "Hold position," Sergeant McBurney commanded. "I'm radioing back to command." The next 30 minutes were an exercise in military procedure. Radio communications with headquarters. Confirmation that the complex was known to military intelligence. Orders to investigate but to proceed carefully, there might still be German forces in the area. As they moved closer, Marcus began to understand what they were looking at. The barbed wire. The guard towers. The way the buildings were arranged with no apparent purpose beyond containment. The complete absence of any German military resistance. This wasn't a military installation. This was something else entirely. The first prisoner they encountered was barely recognizable as human. He was skeletal, his skin hanging loosely on bones that seemed ready to break through at any moment. His eyes were sunken, his hair gone, his clothes, if they could be called that, were little more than rags. He stood at the fence, looking at the tank with an expression that seemed to be processing whether what he was seeing was real. Marcus had seen combat. He had seen men die. He had seen the cost of war written in blood and fire and the screams of the wounded. But nothing had prepared him for this, the systematic, industrialized dehumanization represented by the camp stretched out before him. "Oh God," Private James Patterson whispered from his position in the tank. "Oh God, what is this place?" The orders came from headquarters within minutes: investigate the complex, secure it, and prepare to assist in what was now being called a liberation operation. The 761st Tank Battalion was being asked to free people from a concentration camp, a place whose very existence seemed to mock the ideals that America claimed to be fighting for. Marcus thought of his Bible, the one his mother had given him before he deployed. He thought of passages he had memorized as a child, verses about seeing the afflicted and being moved to action, about the biblical mandate to loose the chains of injustice and let the oppressed go free. Subscribe now to witness the extraordinary story of liberation and human dignity. What these black soldiers discovered will challenge everything you think you know about courage and compassion in the darkest hour. The Tank Battalion rolled into Stalag VIA, for that was the name of the camp, and what they encountered was a scene from hell itself. 18,000 prisoners, though some would say the numbers were even higher. Prisoners from across Europe, Soviet soldiers, Polish civilians, French prisoners of war, Jews, political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, and countless others whom the Nazi regime had deemed unfit for life. The prisoners were dying. They were dying from disease, from starvation, from the systematic cruelty that had been their daily existence for years. And they were dying from the sheer collapse of the system. Now that Germany had surrendered, now that the guards had largely fled, the camp existed in a state of chaos where the prisoners were expected to simply accept their own extinction. Until the 761st arrived. What the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion did in the days following their arrival at Stalag VIA was, in many ways, the opposite of what the army had trained them to do. They were combat soldiers, trained in the use of weapons and the deployment of military force. Instead, they became something else. They became nurses, sanitation workers, logisticians, and above all, they became witnesses to human suffering and people determined to alleviate that suffering. Marcus Johnson found himself working alongside Sergeant McBurney and Private Patterson in what had been the camp's medical area. The conditions were nightmarish. Prisoners lay on wooden bunks, their bodies marked by disease and malnutrition. The stench was overwhelming, the smell of human waste, of disease, of death itself. Medical supplies were essentially non-existent. The few doctors who had been imprisoned in the camp were themselves so weak from starvation that they could barely stand. "We need to contact Division Medical," McBurney said, his voice tight with the effort of maintaining composure in the face of what he was seeing. "We need doctors, medicine, food supplies. All of it. Now." Marcus was assigned to help identify survivors who were critical, who needed immediate medical intervention to survive the night. As he moved through the barracks, learning to read the signs of imminent death, he encountered human beings in states of suffering that seemed almost impossible. A Soviet soldier who had been imprisoned for 4 years, his body reduced to less than 90 pounds. A Polish woman who had lost her entire family and who could speak only a few words before her strength gave out. A child, somehow, impossibly, a child had survived in this place, who flinched at every touch, who had learned that kindness from humans was a rare thing indeed. "Can you understand me?" Marcus asked the child gently, speaking English even though he knew the boy probably couldn't understand. The child was perhaps 8 years old, though malnutrition and trauma made age difficult to determine. The boy looked at him with eyes that seemed to contain the accumulated suffering of the entire camp. Marcus didn't know what to do. The army had trained him to kill, not to heal. But he found himself sitting beside the boy, speaking softly, telling him that he was safe now, that the bad people were gone, that he was going to be okay. He wasn't sure any of it was true. He wasn't sure the boy would survive the night. But he spoke anyway, because silence seemed like a betrayal. The supplies began to arrive. Army medics were dispatched to the camp. Food was brought, carefully at first, because feeding starving people too quickly could kill them as surely as starvation. Doctors who weren't themselves prisoners came from division headquarters. The machinery of the American military, which had been designed to destroy, was now being redirected toward saving. And the 761st Tank Battalion became the face of that salvation. Marcus watched prisoners encounter his fellow soldiers and see, for what may have been the first time in years, human beings treating them as if their lives mattered. He watched a Soviet soldier grab one of the tankers and embrace him, tears streaming down his face. He watched a prisoner who had spoken to no one in months slowly begin to talk again, to reclaim his humanity through conversation with men who listened. The irony was not lost on him. Here were black soldiers, men whose own country treated them as less than human, performing acts of extraordinary compassion toward people whose suffering transcended racial categories. Here was the United States Army, which would segregate these soldiers the moment they returned home, using their skills and their courage to liberate tens of thousands of people from systematic enslavement. Over the course of the next weeks, the 761st worked to organize the camp, to establish medical protocols, to facilitate the transfer of prisoners to hospitals and displaced persons camps. They created order out of chaos. They saved thousands of lives through sheer determination and the willingness to do work that was necessary but not glorious, not the kind of work that would earn medals or recognition. One afternoon, while Marcus was helping to organize a supply depot, an older man approached him. The man was Polish, a survivor who had regained enough strength to move around the camp without assistance. He spoke to Marcus in broken English, his voice carrying the weight of years of silence. "You saved us," the man said simply. "You and your brothers. You came here and you saw us, and you chose to save us. That is everything." Marcus didn't know what to say. The man was right, in a way, but it also seemed inadequate. They had done what any decent human being would do when confronted with such suffering. But that very fact highlighted something uncomfortable, that basic human decency was being presented as extraordinary, that treating people as if their lives mattered was something worth noting and commemorating. "We're just soldiers," Marcus said finally. "No," the old man replied. "You are the soldiers who chose to be human when you could have simply followed orders and walked away. That is rare. That is precious. That is why your presence here matters. Not because you are soldiers, but because you are men who understand that all people have value." As the weeks turned into months, the full scope of what the 761st had encountered began to become clear. Reports filtered in from other units that had liberated camps. The numbers were staggering. Millions of people had been systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. The camp at Stalag VI represented just one small part of a genocide so massive in scale that the human mind struggled to comprehend it. Survivors began to tell their stories. Some of these stories were recorded by army intelligence officers. Some were shared privately with the tankers who had liberated them, who had shown them kindness when they were at their most vulnerable. Marcus interviewed, or rather, listened to, a Polish woman named Sarah who had lost her entire family in the camps. She had been imprisoned for 3 years, and she had survived through a combination of luck and an iron will to live. As she spoke, Marcus found himself struggling with a question that wouldn't leave him alone. How could a world that allowed this, that allowed the systematic genocide of millions, expect Black Americans to continue accepting segregation, discrimination, and violence as the cost of citizenship? Like this video to honor the soldiers who liberated the camps and the survivors who testified to the human cost of hatred, these stories deserve to be remembered and honored. The question was dangerous. It was the kind of question that, if pursued openly, could get you labeled as subversive, as ungrateful, as someone with dangerous ideas about equality. But it was a question that Marcus carried with him, and he knew from conversations with his fellow tankers that they were carrying it too. "We came here and we saw what hate looks like when it gets organized," Sergeant McBurney said one evening as they sat on the steps of one of the camp buildings. "We saw what happens when people decide that some humans are less valuable than others, when they decide that it's acceptable to destroy entire groups of people based on arbitrary characteristics. And then we're going back home to a country that does the same thing, just slower, just less visibly." "Are you saying we should have refused to fight?" Patterson asked. "No," McBurney said thoughtfully. "I'm saying we should fight harder when we get home. We should use what we've learned here. We should remember these faces, these stories, and we should ask ourselves whether we are willing to accept a system that treats human beings as less than based on the color of their skin." The 761st Tank Battalion's role in liberating Stalag VI was not heavily publicized. There were official reports filed, official records kept. But the popular narrative that would emerge from the liberation of the camps would largely focus on the American and Soviet soldiers, with the specific contributions of black units often minimized or forgotten entirely. It was a pattern that the 761st had become accustomed to. They had fought with distinction throughout the war, had earned commendations and respect from the officers who directly commanded them, but they had also known that their achievements would be obscured by the same racial prejudices that had shaped American society. But the survivors remembered. Sarah, the Polish woman, made a point of writing down the names of the soldiers who had been kind to her, who had given her food when she was starving, who had treated her with dignity when she had been reduced to a state of dehumanization. Other survivors did the same. In the years that followed the war, some of these survivors would return to America. Some would eventually encounter members of the 761st, would thank them personally, would ensure that their contributions to liberation were recorded and remembered, even if official military histories sometimes failed to give them proper credit. Marcus Johnson returned to Memphis in the fall of 1945, his uniform still bearing the insignia of the 761st Tank Battalion, his mind still haunted by the faces of the survivors he had helped liberate. He had anticipated segregation. He had anticipated resistance. What he didn't anticipate was the depth of the disconnect between what he had done, what he had witnessed, and what his country was prepared to acknowledge about it. At the bus station in Memphis, he was told to move to the back of the bus. The irony was so profound, so brutal in its clarity, that he had to sit down. He had just spent months liberating people from a system built on the dehumanization of human beings based on arbitrary characteristics. And now he was being told that those characteristics, the color of his skin, meant he didn't deserve to sit in the front of a bus. He moved to the back, but something fundamental had shifted inside him. A line had been crossed. A clarity had been achieved. And there was no going back to the comfortable ignorance of his pre-war years. Marcus didn't become an activist immediately. He got a job, got married, raised a family. But he also became a witness. He told the story of Stalag VIA to anyone who would listen. He spoke in churches. He spoke in schools. He wrote letters to newspapers. And he connected other survivors of the 761st with survivors of the camps, creating a network of testimony that ensured the liberation would not be forgotten. In 1988, 43 years after the war ended, Marcus was invited to speak at a Holocaust museum. It was there that he encountered Sarah again, the Polish woman whose family had been murdered in the camps, who had survived because soldiers like Marcus had liberated her. Sarah was elderly now, her hair white, her face lined by decades of life after trauma. But when she saw Marcus, she embraced him as if no time had passed, as if the intervening decades were irrelevant to a bond forged in the context of catastrophic human suffering and extraordinary human compassion. "You saved my life," Sarah said. "More than that, you saved my life in a way that meant I could believe in humanity again. You showed me, at the moment when I had lost all faith in human goodness, that there were people who saw my suffering and chose to act." Marcus, by then in his 60s, wept. He had carried guilt for decades, guilt that he had survived when so many others had died, guilt that his country had treated him as less than even as it was liberating people from camps built on the principle of treating people as less than. "We did what we could," Marcus said finally. "Yes," Sarah replied. "And what you did changed everything. Not just for me, but for the world. Because you proved that in the face of systematic evil, human beings can choose compassion. You proved that even soldiers, trained in violence, can choose to be merciful. You proved that all people, regardless of the color of their skin, are capable of extraordinary moral action." After the war, many members of the 761st Tank Battalion became instrumental in the civil rights movement. Some became ministers, some became teachers, some became activists. They carried what they had learned in Austria back home with them. They carried the understanding that their liberation, their full acceptance as human beings with equal rights, it was inseparable from the liberation of all oppressed people. Marcus became a teacher. He taught history, but more importantly, he taught his students to think critically about the narratives they were given, to question systems of oppression, to understand that they had a responsibility to speak up when confronted with injustice. Comment below, What does true liberation mean, and what responsibility do we have to those who have been oppressed? This conversation about the ongoing work of creating a just society is one we all need to engage with. The biblical foundation for what the 761st accomplished was something that Marcus returned to repeatedly in his later years. He thought about the book of Leviticus, which commanded, "Do not oppress your neighbor." He thought about Isaiah, which spoke of loosing the chains of injustice and letting the oppressed go free. He thought about Matthew 25, where Jesus identified himself with the hungry, the thirsty, the imprisoned, and suggested that how we treat the least among us determines our standing before God. The 761st didn't need to be theological scholars to understand these principles, Marcus said in one of his last public addresses, given in 2003, 2 years before his death. We were soldiers. But soldiers are also human beings, and human beings have an obligation to recognize the sacred value of every other human being. When we entered that camp, when we saw the prisoners, we saw people who had been treated as less than human. And we chose to treat them as fully human. That was theology in action. That was faith expressed through works. In 2008, the United States Army officially recognized the contributions of the 761st Tank Battalion to the liberation of Stalag VIA and other camps. The recognition came decades after the soldiers who had done the work had begun to age, had begun to pass away. But it represented an acknowledgement, however delayed, that their contribution mattered. More importantly, the recognition ensured that future generations would know the story. In military museums, in history classrooms, in the archives of Holocaust museums, the story of the 761st was preserved. Young people learned that black soldiers had been among the liberators of the camps. Young people learned that the struggle against oppression and for human dignity transcended racial lines, that people who had themselves been oppressed were sometimes the ones best positioned to recognize and respond to the oppression of others. The survivors of Stalag VIA, those who lived long enough to see the recognition, also told their stories. They testified to the humanity of the soldiers who had liberated them. They ensured that the world knew that in the darkest moment of the 20th century, when evil seemed to have triumphed completely, there were people, including black soldiers from a segregated military, who chose to be merciful, who chose to see the image of God in every human being, regardless of what the systems around them suggested about hierarchy and value. Sarah, before her death in 1994, wrote a memoir about her experiences in the camps and her liberation by the 761st. In it, she dedicated an entire chapter to Marcus Johnson and his fellow tankers, describing them not as soldiers but as angels, as messengers of grace in a moment when grace seemed impossible. Decades after the liberation of Stalag VIA, the survivors and the soldiers who had liberated them were gone. But their story remained, preserved in documents, in photographs, in testimonies that had been carefully archived. The legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion extended far beyond their military contributions. They had demonstrated something essential, that human beings have the capacity to choose compassion even in circumstances where that compassion is costly, even when their own nation doesn't recognize their worth, even when systems are arrayed against them. And the survivors, the 18,000 people who had been freed from the camp, carried forward the understanding that their lives had been saved not by chance but by choice. They had been saved by people who saw them in their degradation and chose to respond with humanity. In the Bible, there is a passage in the book of Daniel that speaks of times when some understand and instruct many, and though some will stumble, they will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and like the stars forever and ever. This passage seemed to capture something essential about what the 761st had accomplished. They had shone light into darkness, and that light endured long after they themselves had departed. The 761st Tank Battalion proved that soldiers trained in violence could choose to be healers. They proved that men facing segregation and discrimination in their own country could still extend grace and compassion to strangers. They proved that the human capacity for moral action is not determined by the systems we live in, but by the choices we make within those systems. Marcus Johnson's last public statement, recorded in 2003, was a call for remembrance and continued action. We liberated 18,000 people from a death camp. But liberation doesn't end there. True liberation requires that we continue to work toward a world where no human being is treated as less than, where no system is allowed to develop that dehumanizes entire groups of people. The work we did in Austria was important, but it was only the beginning. The real work, the work of creating a just society, of recognizing the sacred value of every human being, that work continues. And it is the responsibility of every generation to carry that work forward.